The train station at Black Hollow had long been a place of movement, of arrivals and departures, of joyous reunions and tearful farewells. But for the past 10 years, there had been one constant: a dog patiently waiting. He wasn't just any stray. The locals called him Rusty, a golden-furred shepherd mix with eyes that told a story too deep for words. Every day, without fail, he would take his place on the cold stone platform, his gaze fixed on the horizon, waiting for a train that never brought back the man he once knew. It had started on a rainy evening a decade ago. Witnesses recalled a tall man in a dark coat stepping off the 8:45 train. Rusty had followed at his heels, tail wagging, a perfect picture of loyalty. The man had patted Rusty's head, whispered something, and then walked into the foggy night. He never returned. At first, the station staff assumed the man would come back the next day, or the next week. But time stretched on, and soon people stopped expecting. Rusty, however, never did. The seasons passed. Winter draped the station in thick sheets of snow. Summer scorched the pavement, making it unbearable to stand on. Yet, through blistering heat and bone-chilling cold, Rusty waited. Passengers came to recognize him. Some took pity, offering scraps of food. Others, particularly the elderly, would sit beside him and whisper their own sorrows. Rumors began to spread. Some said the man had met an unfortunate fate, lost in the woods or fallen into the river that ran just beyond town. Others believed he had abandoned the dog on purpose, and guilt kept Rusty rooted to the spot. A few claimed it was something darker, that the man had never really existed, that Rusty was waiting for something else. The station had its own history of strangeness. Black Hollow was known for the peculiar. People spoke in hushed tones of the occasional figure seen standing too still beneath the dim lamps at night, of shadows stretching where they shouldn't. No one dared stay too late after the last train left. And yet, Rusty remained. Then, on a bitter autumn evening, something changed. The 8:45 train screeched into the station. Steam hissed, curling like ghostly fingers into the night air. As the doors slid open, a tall figure in a dark coat stepped onto the platform. He looked just as he had 10 years ago, untouched by time, unchanged in any way. And Rusty began to growl. The man who stepped onto the platform that night was known as Daniel Graves. 10 years ago, he had left Black Hollow without a word, swallowed by the fog that clung to the town like a ghostly shroud. To the world, he had vanished. To Rusty, he had simply left. But now he was back. Daniel stood tall, his dark coat dusted with a fine layer of frost from the crisp autumn air. He looked exactly the same as the day he left. Same sharp jawline, same piercing gray eyes, same air of quiet detachment. Not a wrinkle lined his face. Not a strand of hair had turned gray. It was as if time had forgotten him. But Rusty hadn't. The dog's ears flattened, his tail stiff, a low growl rumbling deep in his throat. He did not run to his master. He did not whimper with joy. Instead, he stood his ground, muscles tense, his amber eyes filled with something between wariness and recognition. Daniel met his gaze and smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "You've been waiting," he said, his voice smooth yet oddly hollow. "Good boy." Rusty took a step back. Daniel Graves had never been what you'd call a warm man. Even as a child, he had been quiet, observant, always on the edges of the room rather than in the center of it. He was the kind of boy who listened more than he spoke, who noticed things others missed, small things, strange things. The way shadows sometimes moved on their own. The way certain places felt heavier, as if something unseen was watching. He never talked about it. People who spoke of strange things in Black Hollow had a way of disappearing, becoming the subject of whispered warnings told in candlelight. As he grew older, he tried to ignore the feeling, to live a normal life. He became a history professor, specializing in folklore and forgotten myths. His work took him to old libraries and abandoned places, tracing the echoes of lost stories. It was during one such research trip that he found Rusty, a scrappy little pup with too much energy and a knack for finding trouble. The two became inseparable. But then something changed. The night before Daniel left Black Hollow, something had happened. something he never spoke of. Witnesses claimed they saw him walking down Sycamore Street at midnight, his eyes distant, his expression blank. Some swore he was whispering to himself, his breath curling in the cold air as if he were speaking to something unseen. The last person to see him was old Mrs. Halloway, the town's self-proclaimed historian. She had been sitting on her porch, knitting by the light of a flickering lamp when Daniel passed by. She would later swear on her life that his shadow had been moving in the wrong direction. By morning he was gone. His house remained untouched, his belongings undisturbed. No note, no message. Only Rusty remained, pacing the train station, waiting for the man who would not return. Until now. As Daniel took a step forward, the station lights flickered. A gust of wind swept through the platform, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else. Something that smelled like decay masked in cologne. Rusty let out a low whine, his ears pinned back. Daniel tilted his head. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice light, almost teasing. "Don't you recognize me?" The dog did. But Rusty also recognized that whatever had stepped off that train, it wasn't entirely Daniel Graves. The Black Hollow train station was a relic of another time. Built in the late 1800s, its iron framework and faded wooden benches carried the weight of over a century of whispered farewells and solemn returns. It stood just beyond the town's main square, a lonely structure at the edge of the wilderness. Time had not been kind to it. The roof sagged in places, its wooden beams blackened with age. The old lamps that lined the platform buzzed faintly, their dim yellow glow barely pushing back the thick fog that often rolled in from the nearby woods. Moss had crept between the cracks of the stone pavement, and rust stained the once pristine clock that hung above the ticket booth. The hands of the clock were stuck at 8:45, the precise time of the last train that had arrived on the night Daniel Graves disappeared. The locals knew better than to linger here after sundown. Something about the station didn't feel right, as if the air itself carried an unspoken warning. The wind always blew colder here. The shadows stretched just a little too long. Even the train conductors, hardened men who had spent years riding the rails, avoided looking too closely at the empty benches at night. But for 10 years, Rusty had waited. Black Hollow had always been a strange town, the kind of place where the past never truly faded. There were stories, old stories, passed down through generations, about the land upon which the station was built. Before the railway came, the area had been known as the Hollowing Grounds. In the early 1800s, travelers spoke of a place where the air grew thick, where their horses refused to move, their eyes rolling back in fear. It was said that those who stayed too long would hear whispers in the wind, voices calling their names in hushed, eager tones. Some claimed it was an ancient burial site, others that something had been sealed beneath the earth long ago. When the railroad company decided to build the station, the workers reported strange occurrences. Tools vanished, only to be found miles away. Footsteps echoed in empty corridors at night. The construction foreman, a man named Elias Grady, was said to have gone mad before the station was completed. His final words, scrawled in frantic letters on the wall of his cabin, read, "It's still waiting." No one ever figured out what it was. Now, as Daniel Graves stood on the platform once more, the station seemed almost frozen in time. The air was heavy, damp with the scent of rain-soaked wood and iron. The distant hoot of an owl broke the silence, but even that seemed muffled, as if the very air resisted sound. The fog slithered along the ground, curling around the base of the benches, creeping up the rusted metal poles. The train tracks stretched into the darkness, disappearing into the void beyond the station's lamps. It was said that on certain nights, people could see figures standing just beyond the light's reach, watching. The scent of burning coal lingered in the air, even though steam trains hadn't run on these tracks for decades. A faint metallic tang mixed with it, like old blood. Rusty let out a soft whimper, his ears twitching at sounds only he could hear. The distant, rhythmic clicking of train wheels echoed in the night, even though no train was scheduled to arrive. Something about this place had been wrong for a long time. And now, Daniel Graves had returned. But was it truly him? Or had something else come back in his place? The station had always been quiet at night, but now the silence felt different. It was thick, almost tangible, like the air had grown dense enough to press against the skin. Daniel stood at the edge of the platform, the dim light of the station lamps casting long shadows behind him. Rusty, still frozen in place, let out another low growl. Daniel's lips curled slightly. "You don't trust me, do you?" he murmured, his voice as smooth as it had been 10 years ago. Rusty didn't move. A gust of wind swept through the platform, rattling the rusted signposts and sending a whispering hush through the trees beyond the tracks. The fog thickened, swirling in unnatural patterns, twisting like grasping fingers over the pavement. The station lights flickered, buzzing louder than before. And then the sound came, a sharp, metallic screech. It echoed from the train tracks, a bone-chilling noise that sent a ripple of unease through the air. It was the unmistakable sound of train wheels grinding against steel, distant at first, then growing louder, as if something was approaching. Daniel turned his head slightly, his gray eyes narrowing toward the tracks. Rusty, however, did not follow his gaze. Instead, the dog stayed locked onto Daniel, his body rigid, his breathing slow and deliberate. Another sound joined the screeching metal. A whisper. It was faint, barely audible over the rattling signs and the hum of the station lights. But it was there, threading through the night air like a breath against the skin. "Daniel." The voice came from the darkness beyond the station, from the fog that swallowed the tracks. It was soft, familiar, yet wrong, like an echo of something that had been spoken long ago. Daniel's jaw tightened. Rusty took a step back, and then the train came, or at least it should have. The screeching of metal intensified, the ground trembling ever so slightly beneath their feet. The station lights pulsed, their glow fluctuating wildly. A rush of wind tore through the platform, carrying with it the scent of something old, dust, coal, something metallic, something dead. But no train appeared. The tracks remained empty, stretching into the night like a path to nowhere. The sound, however, remained. The whistle of an oncoming train, the rhythmic chug of its engine, the distant shouts of long-dead passengers. It was all there, but there was nothing to see. Daniel's expression didn't change. If he was disturbed, he didn't show it. Slowly, he crouched down to Rusty's level, his gloved fingers curling under the dog's chin. Rusty flinched but did not bite. His body trembled beneath Daniel's touch. "You hear it too, don't you?" Daniel murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Rusty didn't move. The sounds grew louder. The ghostly train was nearly upon them now, though it remained unseen. The wind howled through the station, and the lights dimmed further, casting eerie shadows along the platform. The smell of burning coal thickened, acrid and suffocating. And then, a figure appeared. It was standing near the tracks, just beyond the edge of the platform. The figure was motionless, bathed in the dying glow of the flickering lamps. Its form was obscured by the thick fog, but there was no mistaking the shape of a person. It stood there watching. Daniel slowly rose to his feet, his gray eyes locked onto the figure, unblinking, unreadable. The whispering returned, this time clearer. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was impossibly close now, just beside his ear. But there was no one there. Rusty let out a sharp, panicked bark, snapping Daniel out of his trance. The moment the dog's voice rang through the night, the station lights surged, blazing bright for a single second before plunging everything into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. Then, the lights sputtered back to life. The figure was gone. The train sounds had vanished, and Daniel Graves stood alone on the platform, his expression unreadable, his lips curving into something that was not quite a smile. Rusty's growl remained, low and unrelenting, because whatever had just happened, it was only the beginning. The station was quiet again, too quiet. The fog clung to the edges of the platform, thick and unmoving, as if something unseen was holding it in place. The streetlights flickered at uneven intervals, their glow cold and anemic. A deep chill settled into the air, far too sharp for an autumn night. Rusty was still growling, low and guttural, his body tense. His hackles were raised, his ears pinned back. He hadn't stopped staring at Daniel. Not at the tracks, not at the empty platform, but at Daniel. Daniel exhaled slowly. "You're afraid of me, aren't you?" Rusty didn't answer, but the way his paws inched backward was enough. The unseen train had been disturbing, but Daniel wasn't surprised. Not really. He had always known this place was strange. That's why he had returned. But the figure? The whisper? That was something else entirely. He turned back toward the tracks. The figure was gone, but Daniel knew better than to assume it had left. Things like that didn't just disappear. They lingered, waiting for the right moment. The memories of the night he left Black Hollow stirred at the back of his mind, fragmented but insistent. He had seen something that night, something that had followed him, something that had never let go. The air felt heavier now, pressing down on his chest like unseen hands. He needed to move, needed to do something. With careful steps, he walked toward the old waiting area. The glass panel doors creaked on their rusted hinges as he pushed them open. Inside, the station was frozen in time. Dust coated the wooden benches. The vending machines stood empty, their lights long dead. A single bulletin board displayed yellowed train schedules that hadn't been updated in a decade. And then there was the mirror. It hung in the corner of the waiting area, above an old wooden bench. The glass was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading from the center. Daniel paused in front of it, staring at his own reflection. Something about it felt wrong. He lifted a hand. His reflection did the same. His face was the same. His clothes. His eyes. No, not his eyes. The reflection's gaze was slightly off. A fraction of a second too slow, the pupils slightly too dark. Daniel took a step closer. The reflection did not. A sharp breath left his lips. The delay was subtle, imperceptible to most. But Daniel had spent years studying things that didn't belong. Things that imitated what was real, but never got it quite right. His reflection blinked. But he hadn't. A deep, cold dread pooled in his stomach. Then, the reflection smiled. Not a natural smile. Not his smile. The kind of smile that was too wide, too forced, stretching the skin in ways that didn't seem possible. Daniel took a step back. His reflection did not. The crack in the mirror spread with a soft, brittle crunch. Rusty let out a sharp bark, breaking the moment. The lights overhead flickered violently, and the entire station seemed to groan as if something deep within its foundation had shifted. Daniel turned sharply, and the reflection was normal again. It stood there, mimicking his every movement, cracks running through its glass prison. But the smile was gone. Had it been there at all? Daniel exhaled, his breath unsteady. Get a grip. But as he turned away from the mirror, one last detail caught his eye. His reflection hadn't turned with him. It was still watching. Daniel didn't stop moving until he was back on the platform. The cold night air a welcome relief. Rusty was pacing now, ears swiveling, nose twitching as if he was trying to track something that kept slipping just out of reach. The station clock still read 8:45. It had never changed. Then, the whisper came again. You were supposed to stay gone. Daniel stiffened. Slowly, he turned his head. The figure was back, standing on the opposite end of the platform, barely visible through the shifting fog. Daniel's pulse quickened. He could see it more clearly now, tall, humanoid clothed in black. Its head tilted slightly, the way a person might if they were examining something curious. Rusty's growling deepened into something primal. Daniel opened his mouth to speak. But before he could, the figure moved. One moment it was at the far end of the platform. The next, it was closer. Much closer. Daniel barely had time to react before the lights above burst. Glass shattered, raining down in sharp fragments. The entire station plunged into darkness. The only light left was the glow of the fog itself. Pale, unnatural, alive. And the whisper came again. Closer. Right behind him. You should have never come back, Daniel. The station had gone completely dark. Only the pale glow of the fog remained, shifting like a living thing, curling around Daniel's feet. The air was thick, too thick to breathe properly. The scent of coal and decay burned in his nostrils. Rusty barked, loud, desperate. But the sound was swallowed almost instantly, like the station itself had devoured it. Daniel turned sharply, every nerve in his body on edge. The figure was gone, but something else had taken its place. A shape, tall, grotesque, wrong, unfolded from the shadows behind him. It wasn't a man. Not anymore. The shape twisted as it emerged, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. Its face, or what should have been a face, remained hidden in the swirling dark, but Daniel could see glimpses of something beneath it. Too many eyes, a mouth that never quite closed, and then it spoke. "You don't belong here anymore, Daniel." Daniel stumbled back. His pulse was a roar in his ears. His breath came in sharp gasps. Rusty lunged but froze midair. The dog's body jerked as if some invisible force had yanked him back. He yelped, legs kicking against nothing, suspended in the cold night air. Daniel's stomach dropped. "Let him go." His voice came out sharper, more desperate than he intended. The thing laughed. Not a human laugh. Not a sound anything living should make. It rattled through the air, vibrating through Daniel's bones, slithering into his mind. "Did you really think you could leave?" The words scraped against reality, heavy and ancient. And suddenly, Daniel remembered. The night he left. The night the station had taken him. He had never boarded a train. He had never even made it off the platform. Because something had called him back. Something that lived in the empty spaces, in the places between time, in the whispers of long-abandoned train stations. And he had answered. For 10 years, he had been somewhere else. Not alive. Not dead. Just waiting. Like Rusty. Like all the others. And now, he was back, but not as himself. Daniel's breath hitched. His fingers curled in his shaking fists. His reflection. The smile. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't just a trick of the light. He had returned to Black Hollow. But what had returned wasn't entirely Daniel Graves. Something had come back, wearing his skin. Something that didn't belong. The entity took a step forward. The ground beneath it groaned. The walls of the station trembled. The clock, still frozen at 8:45, shattered with a sharp, splintering crack. Daniel clenched his jaw. His mind raced. He could feel it now. Something coiled inside of him. Something that wasn't him. A parasite. A passenger. And it was growing stronger. It wanted to take him back. No, not this time. Daniel forced himself to move. He lunged forward, reaching for Rusty, reaching for the only thing that still felt real. The entity's shadowed limbs lashed toward him, cold and suffocating, but Daniel pushed through. He grabbed Rusty, pulling the dog into his arms. The instant he did, the air rippled. The station let out a sound, a low, echoing howl. The fog shrieked as if it were alive. The entity lurched toward them, and Daniel jumped. Darkness swallowed him whole. For a split second, there was nothing. No sound, no air, no pain, just the overwhelming sense of falling. And then, Daniel hit the ground. Hard. His lungs burned as he gasped for air. Cold stone pressed against his back. The scent of damp wood and rain filled his senses. He was outside. Slowly, painfully, he opened his eyes. The fog was gone. The station was gone. And above him, the sky stretched out in an endless, starless void. But Rusty was there, solid, warm, alive. The dog whimpered, pressing close, licking Daniel's face. Daniel let out a breath. A real breath. He was alive. And whatever had tried to take him back was gone. For now. But Black Hollow was never done with its ghosts. And neither was the train station. Daniel lay still, his body aching, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. His mind swam, struggling to process what had just happened. The weight of it all pressed down on him. The station, the whispers, the thing that had worn his skin like a borrowed suit. Had he escaped? Rusty let out a low whine and nuzzled against him, his warmth grounding Daniel in reality. The dog was trembling, but he was here. Alive. Real. Slowly, Daniel sat up. His surroundings had changed. He was no longer at the Black Hollow train station. He was in the woods. The trees loomed around him, skeletal and twisted, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The scent of damp earth and dead leaves filled the air. A fine mist hovered above the ground, curling around the base of the trees like something alive. Daniel swallowed hard. He recognized this place. It was just beyond the station. But how? The last thing he remembered was the fall. The sensation of being swallowed by something vast and endless. And now he was here. Had he really escaped? Or had he just moved deeper into the nightmare? Daniel got to his feet, his legs unsteady. Rusty stayed close, his ears pinned back, his eyes darting to every shadow. Something wasn't right. The trees looked familiar, but off. The air felt wrong. It was too still. No wind. No rustling leaves. No chirping insects. Just silence. And then, a sound. A faint clicking, like a train ticket being punched. Daniel's blood ran cold. Slowly he turned. In the distance, through the mist, he could just barely make out a shape. A figure, standing at the edge of the tree line. Still, watching. Daniel's stomach twisted into knots. He didn't need to see its face. He already knew what it was. It had followed him. He had never really left. Because how could you leave a place that was inside of you? Daniel took a step back, his pulse hammering. Rusty let out a warning growl. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just waited. A memory stirred, rising from the depths of his mind like a corpse floating to the surface. The night he first disappeared. He had seen the same figure standing on the tracks, just beyond the fog. He had felt the same creeping dread curling around his spine. And when he had turned to run, that was when he had been taken. Daniel's breath hitched. The realization was suffocating. This was a cycle. It had always been a cycle. The station didn't just steal people. It brought them back. But each time it took something away. A piece of their soul. A piece of their reality. Until nothing remained but echoes of the people they once were. Daniel clenched his fists. His reflection smile flashed through his mind. Had he already lost too much? Was he even himself anymore? Or was he just another ghost waiting to board a train that would never come? The figure took a step forward. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Rusty barked, the sound shattering the eerie silence. And just like that, the figure was gone. The clicking stopped. The mist thinned. For the first time in 10 years, the station let Daniel go. But as he turned away, as he took that first step toward the world he no longer fully belonged to, a single, chilling thought remained. The train had never arrived, because it was still waiting. And one day, it would come back for him, one way or another.